The mission that changed everything. The desert heat shimmered like waves across the barren landscape as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his rifle scope one final time. The SEAL team had been moving through the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan for 3 days, tracking a high-value target that had eluded capture for months. Their mission was supposed to be simple: locate, observe, and report. But in the world of special operations, simple missions had a way of becoming deadly complicated. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan led the 6-man team through the narrow canyon pass, his weathered face scanning the ridgelines above. At 34, Sullivan had completed more combat deployments than most soldiers see in a lifetime. His team trusted him completely, and he had never let them down. Behind him, the other team members moved like shadows: Rodriguez with his sniper rifle, Thompson the demolitions expert, Garcia the medic, Williams the communications specialist, and Chen the youngest member who served as their technical surveillance expert. The intelligence briefing had been clear. Ahmed Hassan, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces, was operating from a compound in the Spingar Mountains. The team's job was to establish an observation post and gather intelligence on Hassan's activities and associates. They would remain hidden for 72 hours, document everything they could see, and then extract to a predetermined landing zone where helicopters would pick them up. As they approached the target area, Sullivan raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. Through his binoculars, he could see the compound nestled in a valley below. It was larger than the intelligence photos had suggested, with multiple buildings surrounded by high walls and what appeared to be several guard positions. The team had expected to find a small outpost, but this looked more like a fortress. Rodriguez moved to Sullivan's position and peered through his scope. What he saw made his blood run cold. The compound was crawling with armed fighters, far more than their intelligence had indicated. Instead of the dozen or so Taliban fighters they had been briefed about, Rodriguez counted at least 40 armed men moving around the compound. "Sir, we've got a problem," Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "This place is a lot more active than we expected." Sullivan studied the compound through his own optics. The mission parameters had clearly stated they were dealing with a small cell of fighters. What lay before them was obviously a major Taliban stronghold. He faced a difficult decision. They could abort the mission and return to base, but that would mean losing the opportunity to gather intelligence on Hassan's operation. Or they could proceed with the mission, knowing they were walking into a situation far more dangerous than anticipated. Chen, monitoring the radio frequencies, picked up increased chatter from the compound. His Pashto was good enough to understand that the Taliban fighters were discussing security patrols and guard rotations. More concerning was what sounded like preparations for a major operation. If Hassan was planning something significant, the intelligence they could gather might save countless lives. After a tense discussion, Sullivan made the call. They would establish their observation post on a rocky outcrop overlooking the compound and proceed with the mission. The team moved carefully to their position, using the natural cover of boulders and scrub vegetation to remain hidden. They were approximately 800 meters from the compound, close enough to observe details but far enough away to avoid detection. The first 24 hours passed without incident. The team worked in shifts with 2 men always on watch while the others rested. They documented the comings and goings at the compound, photographed key individuals, and intercepted radio communications. Hassan himself had been spotted several times, meeting with various commanders and reviewing what appeared to be maps and operational plans. On the second day, things began to change. Rodriguez noticed increased vehicle traffic around the compound. Pickup trucks loaded with armed fighters arrived throughout the day, and by evening the number of Taliban in the area had nearly doubled. Chen's radio intercepts revealed that word had somehow gotten out about an American presence in the area. The Taliban weren't sure exactly where the Americans were, but they knew someone was watching them. Sullivan realized they were in a precarious position. Their extraction wasn't scheduled for another day, but staying put was becoming increasingly dangerous. He contacted headquarters and requested an early extraction, but was told that weather conditions made helicopter operations impossible until the following evening. They would have to hold their position for at least another 18 hours. As darkness fell on the second night, Garcia spotted movement on the ridgelines around their position. Using night vision equipment, the team confirmed their worst fears. Taliban fighters were moving into the hills, apparently conducting a systematic search of the area. The enemy had figured out roughly where the observation post was located and was closing in. Thompson began preparing charges to destroy their equipment if they had to abandon their position quickly. Williams established contact with headquarters and reported their situation. The response was not encouraging. No immediate air support was available, and the earliest extraction remained 20 hours away. Rodriguez took up a position with his sniper rifle, scanning the approaches to their hideout. Through his scope, he could see Taliban fighters moving methodically through the terrain below. They were being professional about their search, checking every possible hiding place. It was only a matter of time before they found the SEAL team's position. Sullivan gathered his men together and laid out their options. They could try to break contact and move to an alternate extraction site, but that would mean crossing several kilometers of open ground while being hunted by a much larger force. They could stay put and hope the Taliban search parties missed their position, but that seemed increasingly unlikely. Or they could prepare to make a stand and fight their way out when the time came. The team chose to remain in position for as long as possible while preparing for the worst. They arranged their equipment for a quick departure, established fields of fire, and made peace with the possibility that this mission might be their last. Each man checked his weapons and ammunition, knowing that when the shooting started they would be heavily outnumbered. As the night wore on, the Taliban search teams drew closer. The SEAL team could hear voices in the darkness below and see the occasional flash of a flashlight or the glow of a cigarette. The enemy was taking their time, being thorough and getting closer with each passing hour. Just before dawn, Rodriguez spotted a Taliban patrol working its way up the slope toward their position. The enemy fighters were less than 200 meters away and moving directly toward the observation post. There was no doubt now they had been discovered. In a few minutes the shooting would start, and 6 Navy SEALs would find themselves fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Sullivan looked at his watch and calculated the time until their scheduled extraction. 15 hours. They had to survive 15 more hours before help could reach them. The question was no longer whether they would be discovered, but whether they could stay alive long enough for rescue to arrive. The first contact. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as the Taliban patrol climbed steadily toward the SEAL team's hiding place. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the lead fighter paused to examine disturbed earth, where Chen had repositioned during the night. The enemy was close enough now that the Americans could hear individual voices and the scrape of boots against stone. Sullivan made rapid hand signals to his team. They would wait until the Taliban patrol was within 50 meters before opening fire. The element of surprise was their only advantage against superior numbers. Each SEAL selected his primary target and prepared for the firefight that would determine whether they lived or died. The lead Taliban fighter suddenly stopped and pointed directly at their position. He had spotted something. Perhaps the glint of sunlight off an optical device or the unnatural outline of military equipment against the rocks. For a moment, time seemed frozen as the two forces stared at each other across the diminishing distance. Rodriguez made the decision for everyone. His rifle barked once and the lead Taliban fighter dropped instantly. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and suddenly the quiet morning erupted into chaos. The remaining Taliban fighters in the patrol immediately took cover and began returning fire. Their AK-47s chattered angrily as bullets sparked off the rocks around the SEAL position. Thompson lobbed a grenade down the slope and the explosion sent dirt and debris flying in all directions. 2 more Taliban fighters were caught in the blast and fell silent, but the damage was done. The gunfire had alerted every Taliban fighter in the area to the Americans' exact location. Within minutes, radio calls were crackling across the valley as enemy reinforcements began moving toward the ridge. From their observation post, the SEALs could see fighters pouring out of the compound, below and vehicles racing along the dirt roads that crisscrossed the area. Sullivan knew they had bought themselves some time by eliminating the initial patrol, but their situation was about to become much worse. He counted at least 60 Taliban fighters moving toward their position from multiple directions. The enemy was organizing a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the small SEAL team through sheer numbers. Williams worked frantically with his radio equipment, trying to raise headquarters and request immediate air support. The mountains interfered with communications, and he struggled to establish a clear connection. When he finally got through, the news was devastating. No close air support was available for at least 4 hours, and the helicopter extraction remained impossible until evening due to weather conditions in the area. Garcia treated a flesh wound on Thompson's arm, where a bullet had grazed him during the initial firefight. The injury was minor, but it served as a reminder of how quickly their situation could deteriorate. The team had limited medical supplies, and any serious injury would make their chances of survival even slimmer. Chen monitored Taliban radio frequencies and provided updates on enemy movements. The intercepted communications painted a grim picture. Hassan himself was coordinating the assault on their position. He had divided his forces into 3 groups that would attack from different directions simultaneously. The Taliban commander was experienced enough to know that the Americans would try to break out through the weakest point in the encirclement, so he was ensuring there would be no weak points. Rodriguez repositioned his sniper rifle and began engaging targets at longer range. His job was to disrupt the Taliban formations before they could organize their assault. Through his scope, he could see enemy fighters moving through the rocks below, trying to work their way closer to the SEAL position. Each shot had to count. The team carried limited ammunition, and they needed to make every round effective. The first coordinated Taliban assault came from the east. A group of fighters attempted to rush the SEAL position, while others provided covering fire from concealed positions. Sullivan and Chen met the attack with disciplined rifle fire, dropping several attackers before the rest fell back to regroup. But the brief engagement consumed precious ammunition and revealed how determined their enemies were. Thompson identified several routes the Taliban might use to approach their position and prepared improvised explosive devices to cover those avenues. The team's demolitions expert worked quickly, using claymore mines and grenades to create deadly surprises for anyone trying to storm their hideout. The explosives would help even the odds, but they also represented finite resources that couldn't be replaced. As the morning progressed, the Taliban attacks became more sophisticated. Hassan was clearly a competent military leader who understood small unit tactics. Instead of launching headlong assaults, he began using suppressing fire to pin down the Americans, while small groups of fighters moved to better positions. The enemy was slowly tightening the noose around the SEAL team. Rodriguez spotted a Taliban fighter with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher taking position on a ridge 400 meters away. The RPG represented a serious threat to their rocky shelter. A direct hit could kill or wound multiple team members and destroy their equipment. Rodriguez adjusted his aim carefully and squeezed the trigger. The enemy fighter tumbled backward and disappeared behind the rocks, but another fighter immediately took his place. Williams finally established reliable communication with headquarters and requested emergency air support. The operations center promised to divert aircraft from other missions, but warned that it would take several hours for jets to reach their location. In the meantime, the SEAL team would have to hold their position without outside support. The Taliban launched their most serious assault just before noon. Groups of fighters attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, while others laid down intense covering fire. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley as bullets ricocheted off rocks and whined overhead. Sullivan's team responded with controlled, aimed fire, making each shot count while conserving ammunition for the longer fight ahead. Garcia was forced to expose himself to drag Thompson to safety when a bullet shattered the rocks next to the demolitions expert's head. A fragment of stone opened a cut above Thompson's eye, temporarily blinding him with blood. Garcia bandaged the wound quickly while bullets continued to snap overhead. The team's safe hiding place was becoming a death trap. Chen's radio intercepts revealed that Hassan was growing frustrated with his fighters' inability to overrun the American position. The Taliban commander was bringing up additional weapons, including mortars that could rain explosive shells down on the SEAL team from beyond rifle range. If Hassan got those mortars into position, the rocky outcrop would offer no protection at all. Sullivan assessed their desperate situation as the Taliban assault finally broke off. His team had survived the coordinated attack, but they were running low on ammunition and had suffered several minor injuries. More importantly, they were completely surrounded by a force that outnumbered them 10-1. The enemy was learning from each attack, adapting their tactics, and bringing up heavier weapons. Rodriguez estimated they had enough ammunition for maybe 2 more serious firefights before they would be forced to rely on pistols and hand grenades. The team's water supply was also running low in the desert heat, and the stress of constant combat was taking its toll on everyone. They needed a miracle, or they would not survive until their scheduled extraction. As if reading his thoughts, Williams received a radio message that made everyone's heart sink. The weather conditions that were preventing helicopter operations had actually worsened. Their extraction would have to be delayed by at least 12 hours, possibly longer. The SEAL team was on their own until the following morning, facing an enemy that grew stronger with each passing hour. Surrounded and running low, the afternoon heat became unbearable as the sun reached its peak above the Afghan mountains. Sullivan wiped sweat from his eyes and checked his ammunition supply once more. Each team member was down to less than half their original load, and the Taliban showed no signs of giving up their assault. If anything, Hassan seemed to be enjoying the tactical challenge of rooting out the American Special Forces team. Garcia moved carefully between his teammates, checking wounds and administering what medical care he could with their limited supplies. Thompson's head wound had stopped bleeding, but he was developing a headache that made concentration difficult. Rodriguez had taken a bullet graze across his shoulder that burned like fire, but didn't affect his ability to shoot. Williams had cuts on his hands from sharp rock fragments, and Chen was nursing bruised ribs from diving for cover during the last attack. The Taliban had established firing positions on 3 sides of the SEAL team's rocky outcrop. Enemy fighters took turns keeping the Americans pinned down with sporadic gunfire, while others moved equipment and prepared for the next assault. Hassan was clearly in no hurry. He had the Americans trapped and could afford to take his time, planning their destruction. Chen intercepted radio traffic indicating that Taliban reinforcements were arriving from other areas. Pickup trucks loaded with fighters had been spotted on the roads leading to the valley, and Hassan was coordinating with other commanders to ensure the Americans could not escape. The enemy now had over 80 fighters in the immediate area, with more arriving every hour. Rodriguez used his sniper scope to study the Taliban positions and identify priority targets. He could see enemy fighters digging in among the rocks, preparing fighting positions that would be difficult to suppress with rifle fire. More concerning was the sight of fighters carrying mortars and heavy machine guns toward the high ground, overlooking the SEAL position. Sullivan realized that their tactical situation was hopeless unless something changed dramatically. The team was outnumbered, running low on ammunition and faced with increasingly heavy weapons. Their rocky hideout provided good protection against rifle fire, but would offer no defense against mortars or rocket-propelled grenades fired from elevated positions. Thompson prepared their remaining explosive devices for a final desperate defense. The demolitions expert had managed to save 2 claymore mines and several hand grenades, along with the charges meant to destroy their equipment if capture seemed imminent. It wasn't much firepower against such overwhelming odds, but it might buy them a few more precious minutes. Williams continued attempting to contact headquarters and request emergency support. The radio communications were sporadic due to the mountainous terrain, but he managed to convey their desperate situation to the operations center. The response was always the same. No air support could reach them for several more hours, and ground reinforcements were impossible given their remote location. As the afternoon wore on, the Taliban began probing attacks designed to test the Americans' remaining strength. Small groups of fighters would advance toward the SEAL position, draw fire, and then retreat to cover. Hassan was trying to determine how much ammunition his enemies had left and identify weak points in their defensive perimeter. Rodriguez made every shot count, carefully selecting targets that would have the maximum impact on enemy morale and capabilities. He focused on Taliban leaders and fighters carrying heavy weapons, knowing that eliminating key personnel might slow down the coordinated attacks. But for every enemy fighter he dropped, 2 more seemed to take their place. Garcia reported that their water supply was critically low. The desert heat and stress of combat had accelerated dehydration, and the team would soon be facing reduced effectiveness due to lack of fluids. In the brutal Afghan sun, a soldier could become incapacitated by heat exhaustion within hours if not properly hydrated. Chen's radio intercepts revealed that Hassan was planning a major assault for late afternoon. The Taliban commander intended to overwhelm the American position through sheer firepower and numbers. Mortar teams were being positioned to shell the rocky outcrop, while fighters attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The enemy had learned that piecemeal attacks allowed the Americans to concentrate their defensive fire. So this time they would use everything at once. Sullivan gathered his team for what might be their final tactical discussion. They could attempt to break out of the encirclement before the major assault began, but that would mean abandoning their defensive position and fighting their way across open ground against overwhelming odds. They could stay and fight from their current position, using their remaining ammunition and explosives to inflict maximum casualties before being overrun. Or they could try to call in danger-close artillery fire from a distant firebase, which might eliminate some of the Taliban force but would also risk killing the American team. The discussion was interrupted by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Hassan had begun his bombardment earlier than expected, and explosive shells began falling around the SEAL position. The team pressed themselves against the rocks as shrapnel whined overhead and debris rained down on their hiding place. Rodriguez spotted the mortar position through his scope and attempted to engage the crew, but the range was too great for accurate rifle fire. The Taliban had positioned their heavy weapons beyond the effective range of the American small arms, allowing them to shell the position with relative impunity. Thompson set off one of his claymore mines as a group of Taliban fighters attempted to use the mortar barrage as cover for an advance. The directional mine's steel balls swept the approaching enemies, dropping several and forcing the rest to seek cover. But the explosion also revealed the mine's position, and Taliban fighters began concentrating fire on that sector. Garcia was knocked unconscious briefly when a mortar round exploded close enough to shower their position with rocks and dirt. When he came to, he found blood running from his nose and ears, signs of a possible concussion from the blast overpressure. The team's medic was injured, leaving them with even fewer resources for treating future casualties. Williams managed to establish contact with a distant artillery unit and began the complex process of calling for fire support. The procedure required precise coordinates and careful calculation to avoid hitting their own position. But even if the artillery fire was accurate, it would take several minutes for the rounds to travel from the firing position to the target area. Chen reported that Taliban radio traffic indicated the final assault would begin within minutes. Hassan was coordinating his forces for a simultaneous attack from all directions, supported by mortars and machine guns. The enemy commander was confident that this assault would finally overwhelm the stubborn Americans who had caused him so much trouble. Sullivan checked his rifle and counted his remaining ammunition one final time. 18 rounds in his current magazine plus 2 full magazines in his gear. 66 bullets to hold off 80 or more enemy fighters. The mathematics of survival were not encouraging, but Navy SEALs were trained to fight against impossible odds. Rodriguez took careful aim at what appeared to be Hassan himself, visible for a moment as the Taliban commander moved between positions. The shot was at the extreme range of the sniper rifle, complicated by heat distortion and the need to account for wind and elevation. Rodriguez controlled his breathing and slowly squeezed the trigger, but the bullet struck rocks inches from the target. Hassan dove for cover and disappeared from sight. The final Taliban assault began with a crescendo of gunfire that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Muzzle flashes sparkled from dozens of positions as enemy fighters poured fire into the American position. Bullets whined and sparked off rocks while mortar rounds continued to fall around the SEAL team's hideout. Sullivan and his men returned fire with desperate precision, knowing that every shot had to count. They were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and their ammunition would not last much longer. In a few minutes, they would be reduced to pistols and hand grenades against an enemy armed with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. As the Taliban fighters closed in from multiple directions, Sullivan wondered if anyone would ever know how hard his team had fought, or how much intelligence they had gathered about enemy operations. Their mission to observe and report had turned into a fight to the death in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan. The Unknown Guardian. 2 miles away from the desperate firefight, Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Ghost Morrison lay perfectly still in a shallow depression among the rocks. He had been watching the battle through his high-powered scope for the past hour, calculating distances and wind patterns while remaining completely invisible to both sides of the conflict. Morrison was not part of Sullivan's team, nor was he officially supposed to be in this area of Afghanistan. The experienced sniper was conducting his own classified operation, hunting a different high-value target in the region when he heard the distant gunfire and decided to investigate. What he discovered through his optics made his blood run cold. 6 American operators were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. At 42 years old, Morrison had spent more than half his life as a military sniper. He held the unofficial record for the longest confirmed kill shot in Navy SEAL history, and his nickname Ghost came from his ability to move through enemy territory without being detected. Morrison was a legend among special operations snipers, the man other shooters aspired to become. Through his scope, Morrison could see the Taliban fighters maneuvering around the American position like ants surrounding their prey. He counted more than 70 enemy fighters, with additional reinforcements still arriving. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The Americans would be overrun within minutes unless something changed the tactical equation dramatically. Morrison's own mission was classified at the highest levels, and he was under strict orders to avoid contact with other American forces in the area. Revealing his presence could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and put other lives at risk. But watching fellow SEALs die while he remained hidden was not an option his conscience could accept. The Master Chief began calculating firing solutions to the most dangerous Taliban positions. His rifle was a custom-built .338 Lapua Magnum, capable of accurate fire at distances exceeding 1,500 meters. From his concealed position, Morrison could engage targets that were well beyond the range of the surrounded Americans' weapons. Morrison identified Hassan coordinating the assault from a protected position behind a large boulder. The Taliban commander was approximately 1,200 meters away, a challenging shot but well within the Master Chief's capabilities. Eliminating Hassan might disrupt the coordinated attack and give the American team a chance to survive. The wind conditions were tricky, with gusting crosswinds that would affect bullet trajectory over such a long distance. Morrison used his portable weather station to measure wind speed and direction at his position, then estimated conditions along the bullet's flight path. He adjusted his scope accordingly and controlled his breathing as he prepared for the most important shot of his career. Hassan appeared in Morrison's crosshairs for a brief moment as the Taliban commander moved to observe the assault on the American position. Morrison squeezed the trigger with practiced precision, and the heavy rifle bucked against his shoulder. Through his scope, he watched Hassan suddenly collapse behind the boulder, struck down by a bullet that had traveled nearly 3/4 of a mile to find its target. The effect on the Taliban assault was immediate and dramatic. Without Hassan's leadership, the coordinated attack began to falter as confused fighters looked around for orders that would never come. Several Taliban fighters abandoned their assault positions and ran toward their fallen commander, creating opportunities for Morrison to engage additional targets. Morrison shifted his aim to a Taliban machine gun position that had been pouring devastating fire into the American defensive perimeter. The enemy gunner was hunched over his weapon, concentrating on his targets and unaware of the threat from an entirely different direction. Morrison's second shot silenced the machine gun permanently and sent the assistant gunner scrambling for cover. From his distant vantage point, Morrison could see the American team taking advantage of the sudden reduction in enemy fire. The SEALs were repositioning and returning fire with renewed intensity, clearly puzzled by the unexpected turn of events but professional enough to exploit any tactical advantage. Morrison continued methodically engaging Taliban fighters who posed the greatest threat to the surrounded Americans. His shots came from such a long distance that the enemy fighters couldn't determine where the sniper fire was originating. The Taliban began to panic as their comrades fell to an invisible enemy, and their assault on the American position completely broke down. A Taliban fighter with an RPG launcher was preparing to fire at the American position when Morrison's bullet found him. The rocket-propelled grenade exploded harmlessly among the rocks, sending fragments flying but causing no casualties. Morrison had prevented the enemy from using their most dangerous weapon against the trapped SEALs. Morrison noticed a group of Taliban fighters attempting to establish a new mortar position in a location that would allow them to rain shells directly onto the American hideout. The Master Chief adjusted his aim and began engaging the mortar crew one by one. His precise shots eliminated the threat before the enemy could register their weapon and begin an effective bombardment. The Taliban forces were now in complete disarray, with fighters taking cover and looking fearfully at the ridgelines around them. They knew they were being hunted by an expert marksman, but they had no idea where the shots were coming from. Some fighters began retreating toward the compound, abandoning the assault entirely. Morrison identified what appeared to be Hassan's second-in-command attempting to rally the demoralized Taliban fighters. The enemy leader was shouting orders and gesturing toward the American position, trying to reorganize the assault. Morrison's bullet ended the rally before it could begin, and the would-be commander joined his leader in death. Through his radio equipment, Morrison monitored the tactical frequency being used by the surrounded SEAL team. He could hear their confusion about the sudden change in their tactical situation, but also their professionalism as they continued fighting while trying to understand what was happening. The Americans had no way of knowing that they had a guardian angel watching over them from the distant mountains. Morrison continued his deadly work, systematically eliminating Taliban fighters who posed the greatest threat to the American team. His years of experience allowed him to prioritize targets effectively, focusing on enemy leaders, weapons crews, and fighters in positions that could threaten the SEALs. Each shot was carefully calculated and precisely executed. The Taliban assault completely collapsed as fighters fled in panic or took cover in positions where they could no longer threaten the Americans. Morrison's intervention had transformed a hopeless situation into a tactical victory. Though the surrounded SEALs still faced the challenge of surviving until their extraction could be completed, Morrison knew that his unauthorized intervention had probably compromised his own mission and would certainly result in difficult questions from his superiors. But as he watched the American team begin treating their wounded and consolidating their defensive position, he felt no regret about his decision to help fellow warriors in desperate need. The Master Chief began planning his own extraction from the area, knowing that Taliban reinforcements would eventually arrive and begin searching for the mysterious sniper, who had turned their victory into a devastating defeat. Morrison would disappear back into the mountains as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind only the evidence of his deadly precision. Through his scope, Morrison watched the SEAL team as they cautiously began to assess their changed situation. The Americans were still surrounded and outnumbered, but the immediate threat to their survival had been eliminated by shots fired from a position so distant that the enemy never identified the source. Morrison smiled grimly as he began packing his equipment for movement to a new position. The SEALs would probably never know who had saved their lives, but that didn't matter to the Master Chief. In the Brotherhood of Special Operations Forces, warriors looked out for each other regardless of official mission parameters or classified operational restrictions. The tide-turned Sullivan couldn't believe what he was seeing through his binoculars. One moment the Taliban assault had been closing in from all sides with overwhelming firepower, and the next moment, enemy fighters were dropping like flies to an unseen shooter. Hassan himself had suddenly collapsed behind his command position, followed by the machine gunner who had been making their lives miserable for hours. "What the hell is happening out there?" Thompson asked, pressing a bandage against his bleeding head wound while peering cautiously over the rocks. The demolitions expert had been preparing for a final desperate stand when the enemy fire suddenly decreased dramatically. Rodriguez was scanning the surrounding terrain through his sniper scope, trying to identify the source of the unexpected assistance. "Somebody's out there with a long-range rifle," he reported. "Has to be at least 1,000 meters away, maybe more. I can't see muzzle flashes or identify the position." Chen monitored Taliban radio frequencies and provided a running translation of the increasingly panicked communications. The enemy fighters were reporting that their commander was down, and they were taking fire from an unknown sniper. Several groups were requesting permission to withdraw, and the coordinated assault had completely fallen apart. Garcia used the lull in enemy fire to move between team members and assess their medical situation. Thompson's head wound was superficial but bloody. Rodriguez's shoulder graze was painful but not debilitating, and Williams had multiple cuts from rock fragments. The team was battered but still functional, though their ammunition situation remained critical. Sullivan tried to make sense of the tactical situation while maintaining security. No American forces were supposed to be operating in this area, and no sniper support had been mentioned in their mission briefing. Yet someone with extraordinary skill was systematically eliminating Taliban fighters from a position so distant that even their advanced optics couldn't locate the shooter. Williams attempted to contact headquarters and report the changed situation, But the mountainous terrain continued to interfere with radio communications. When he finally established contact, the operations center was as puzzled as the field team about the identity of their mysterious benefactor. Morrison continued his deadly work from his concealed position, methodically eliminating Taliban fighters who posed the greatest threat to the surrounded Americans. His shots were coming at irregular intervals, carefully timed to maximize psychological impact on the demoralized enemy forces. The Master Chief watched through his scope as a group of Taliban fighters attempted to drag Hassan's body to safety. Morrison's next shot dropped the fighter carrying the Taliban commander's feet, and the others immediately abandoned their leader's corpse and fled for cover. The message was clear. Anyone who exposed themselves would become a target. Rodriguez finally spotted a muzzle flash in the distance and estimated the unknown sniper's position. "Whoever's out there is at least 1,500 meters away," he reported with professional admiration. "That's some seriously impressive shooting at this range and in these wind conditions." Sullivan began planning how to exploit their unexpected tactical advantage. The Taliban assault had been broken, but enemy fighters still occupied positions around their perimeter. With the pressure reduced, the SEAL team could begin engaging Taliban positions more aggressively and perhaps even attempt to break out of the encirclement. Thompson used the respite to reposition his remaining explosive devices, creating new obstacles for any renewed Taliban assault. The demolitions expert was feeling optimistic for the first time in hours, though he remained puzzled about their mysterious guardian angel's identity and motives. Chen reported that Taliban radio traffic indicated growing confusion and fear among the remaining fighters. Without Hassan's leadership, different groups were receiving conflicting orders from various commanders. Some fighters were being told to continue the assault, while others were ordered to withdraw and regroup at the compound. Morrison identified a Taliban sniper who had been taking shots at the American position from a concealed location among the rocks. The enemy shooter was skilled enough to remain hidden from the SEAL's return fire, but Morrison's elevated position provided a clear view of the hiding spot. The Master Chief's bullet eliminated the threat permanently. Garcia spotted Taliban fighters attempting to recover weapons and equipment from their fallen comrades. The team's medic engaged them with accurate rifle fire, forcing the enemy to abandon their efforts and seek cover. For the first time since the battle began, the Americans were able to suppress enemy movement effectively. Sullivan decided to attempt communication with their unknown benefactor. Using his tactical radio, he broadcast on multiple frequencies, hoping to reach whoever was providing sniper support. "Unknown friendly, this is SEAL Team 6. We appreciate the assistance. Can you identify yourself?" Morrison heard the radio call but chose not to respond. Revealing his presence could compromise his classified mission and create complications for both teams. The Master Chief preferred to remain anonymous while continuing to provide overwatch for the surrounded Americans. Williams reported that Taliban vehicle traffic had increased dramatically on the roads leading away from the compound. Enemy fighters were apparently evacuating the area rather than face the mysterious sniper who had already eliminated their key leaders and disrupted their assault. Rodriguez began engaging Taliban positions more aggressively, taking advantage of the reduced return fire to eliminate specific threats. The team's designated marksman was finally able to operate effectively, without being pinned down by overwhelming enemy fire from multiple directions. Thompson triggered his remaining Claymore mine as a group of Taliban fighters attempted to assault the American position. The directional mine's steel ball swept the approaching enemies, convincing the survivors that continuing the attack would be suicidal. The assault broke off entirely as the remaining fighters retreated to safer positions. Chen intercepted radio communications indicating that Taliban reinforcements from other areas were being recalled. Word had spread about the devastating sniper fire, and commanders were reluctant to commit additional forces to what had become a killing ground. The psychological impact of Morrison's intervention was proving as valuable as the physical casualties he had inflicted. Sullivan realized that their tactical situation had fundamentally changed. Instead of being trapped and waiting to die, his team now had the initiative. The Taliban fighters were demoralized and leaderless, while the Americans had an unknown but highly effective ally providing overwatch from the surrounding mountains. Garcia completed his medical assessment and reported that while the team had multiple minor injuries, Everyone remained combat effective. The reduced enemy pressure had allowed him to properly treat wounds and ensure that no one was suffering from serious blood loss or shock. Morrison continued scanning for targets through his powerful scope. But the Taliban fighters had learned to stay hidden after watching their comrades fall to the invisible sniper. The Master Chief's intervention had achieved its primary purpose. The immediate threat to the SEAL team had been neutralized. Williams finally established reliable communication with headquarters and provided a detailed report on their changed situation. The operations center was amazed by the turnaround, but remained unable to explain the source of the sniper support that had saved the mission. Rodriguez attempted to locate additional Taliban positions using his scope, but the enemy had gone to ground after the devastating losses they had suffered. Occasional movement could be detected in the distance, but the fighters were clearly reluctant to expose themselves to the deadly accurate fire that had already claimed so many of their comrades. Sullivan made the decision to hold their current position and wait for their scheduled extraction. The team's ammunition situation remained critical, but they were no longer facing imminent destruction. Their mysterious guardian had given them the gift of time, and Sullivan intended to use it wisely. Thompson redistributed the team's remaining ammunition to ensure everyone had enough rounds for their individual weapons. The demolitions expert estimated they could handle one more serious firefight if necessary, but hoped their unknown ally would continue providing overwatch until the helicopters arrived. Chen reported that Taliban radio traffic indicated the compound was being evacuated. Hassan's death had apparently triggered a general withdrawal from the area, with fighters loading vehicles and departing for safer locations. The intelligence value of observing this evacuation was almost as important as surviving the battle itself. Morrison watched the Taliban withdrawal through his scope and felt satisfaction at having disrupted a major enemy operation. His unauthorized intervention had not only saved American lives, but had also caused the enemy to abandon what appeared to be an important stronghold in the region. The afternoon sun continued its relentless assault on both the Americans and their enemies, but the tactical situation had stabilized dramatically. Where once the SEAL team faced certain death, they now controlled their immediate area and were preparing for extraction rather than making final stands. Sullivan looked at his watch and calculated the time remaining until their helicopter pickup. 8 hours until darkness, when the aircraft could approach safely under cover of night. 8 hours that had seemed impossible to survive just minutes earlier, but now appeared manageable thanks to their unknown protector. Garcia used the relative quiet to establish better fighting positions and improve their defensive perimeter. The team's medic was optimistic about their chances for the first time since the battle began, though he remained alert for any renewal of the Taliban assault. Williams continued monitoring multiple radio frequencies, listening for any indication that enemy reinforcements might be approaching or that their extraction schedule might change. The communications specialist was grateful for the unexpected turn of events, but remained professionally focused on their mission requirements. Rodriguez kept his rifle trained on the most likely approaches to their position, ready to engage any Taliban fighters who might attempt another assault. The team's sniper was eager to learn the identity of the marksman who had demonstrated such extraordinary skill at extreme range. Morrison began planning his own extraction from the area, knowing that his presence would eventually be detected if he remained in position much longer. The Master Chief had accomplished his unofficial mission of saving fellow Americans, and now he needed to disappear before his own classified operation was compromised. The long wait as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sullivan's team settled into a defensive routine that would carry them through the remaining hours until extraction. The dramatic change in their tactical situation still felt surreal. One moment they had been preparing to die fighting against impossible odds, and the next they found themselves in a relatively secure position with an unknown guardian watching over them. Rodriguez maintained overwatch with his sniper rifle, scanning the surrounding terrain for any sign of renewed Taliban activity. The enemy fighters had gone to ground after suffering devastating casualties, but the experienced sniper knew that desperate men could still be dangerous. Through his scope, he occasionally caught glimpses of movement in the distance, but no one seemed willing to expose themselves to the deadly accurate fire that had already claimed so many lives. Chen continued monitoring Taliban radio frequencies and providing updates on enemy communications. The intercepted traffic painted a picture of confusion and fear among the remaining fighters. Different commanders were issuing conflicting orders, some calling for renewed attacks while others demanded immediate evacuation of the area. Without Hassan's unifying leadership, the Taliban force was fragmenting into arguing factions. Garcia used the relative quiet to conduct a more thorough medical assessment of his teammates. Thompson's head wound had stopped bleeding, though the demolitions expert was experiencing headaches that suggested a mild concussion. Rodriguez's shoulder graze was painful but not debilitating, and the other minor injuries were healing normally. Most importantly, everyone remained combat effective and alert. Williams worked to establish more reliable communications with headquarters, using the improved tactical situation to experiment with different radio positions and frequencies. When he finally achieved clear contact, the operations center confirmed that helicopter extraction remained scheduled for after nightfall. Weather conditions in the region were improving, and aircraft would be available when darkness provided cover for the dangerous flight into the mountains. Sullivan took advantage of the lull to redistribute equipment and ammunition among his team members. They were still critically short of bullets, but no longer facing the immediate prospect of being overrun by superior numbers. The team leader estimated they could handle one more serious firefight if necessary, though he hoped their mysterious protector would prevent any such encounter. Thompson conducted a detailed inventory of their remaining explosive devices and found the situation less dire than he had feared. The demolitions expert still had several hand grenades and one functioning claymore mine, along with the charges intended to destroy sensitive equipment if capture seemed imminent. It wasn't much firepower against a determined assault, but it was enough to discourage casual attacks. Morrison remained in his concealed position, watching the American team through his powerful scope while scanning for any signs of renewed Taliban activity. The Master Chief had accomplished his immediate goal of saving fellow SEALs, but he couldn't abandon his overwatch position until he was certain they would survive until extraction. His own classified mission would have to wait. As the afternoon progressed, the psychological effects of the Taliban defeat became increasingly apparent. Chen reported that radio intercepts indicated widespread demoralization among the remaining enemy fighters. Many were requesting permission to withdraw entirely from the area, while others spoke of supernatural intervention and cursed snipers who could kill from impossible distances. Rodriguez spotted a small group of Taliban fighters attempting to recover weapons and equipment from their fallen comrades. The enemy soldiers moved cautiously, clearly terrified of the invisible marksman who had already demonstrated his deadly capabilities. Rodriguez held his fire, knowing that his own ammunition was too precious to waste on such distant targets. Garcia established an improved first aid station in a protected area among the rocks, preparing for the possibility that renewed fighting might produce additional casualties. The team's medic had learned long ago that battles could change direction suddenly, and wounded men needed immediate treatment to survive in the harsh Afghan environment. Sullivan calculated and recalculated the time remaining until their extraction, knowing that every hour brought them closer to safety, but also increased the chances that Taliban reinforcements might arrive from other areas. The team leader tried to balance optimism about their survival with realistic assessment of the dangers that still surrounded them. Morrison noticed increased vehicle traffic on the roads leading away from the compound, confirming that the Taliban were conducting a general evacuation of the area. Through his scope, he could see pickup trucks loaded with fighters and equipment departing toward more secure locations. Hassan's death had triggered exactly the kind of disruption that special operations teams hoped to achieve. Williams received updated intelligence from headquarters indicating that other American forces in the region had detected the Taliban withdrawal. The enemy's retreat was being monitored by surveillance aircraft, and the information gathered would prove valuable for future operations against Taliban. Networks in eastern Afghanistan. Chen reported a significant decrease in radio traffic from the remaining Taliban fighters in the immediate area. The enemy communications that continued suggested that most fighters were focused on escape rather than renewed assault. However, the intelligence specialist warned that desperate men might still attempt surprise attacks. Rodriguez identified what appeared to be a Taliban observation post on a distant ridge, but the enemy fighters there seemed content to watch rather than engage. The psychological impact of the mysterious sniper had clearly affected Taliban morale throughout the region, not just among the forces that had directly experienced the devastating accurate fire. Thompson used the quiet period to improve their defensive positions, arranging rocks and equipment to provide better protection against rifle fire. The demolitions expert also prepared additional obstacles that would funnel any attacking force into predetermined killing zones where the team's limited ammunition could be used most effectively. Garcia treated his own minor injuries, having focused on his teammates' wounds during the height of the battle. The team's medic had cuts on his hands and arms from rock fragments, along with bruises from diving for cover during the mortar bombardment. None of the injuries were serious, but they served as reminders of how close they had come to disaster. Sullivan attempted once more to contact their unknown benefactor, broadcasting on multiple frequencies in hopes of establishing communication with the sniper who had saved their lives. The team leader wanted to coordinate their extraction with whoever was providing overwatch, but received no response to his radio calls. Morrison heard Sullivan's radio transmissions but chose to maintain his anonymity. The Master Chief's presence in the area was highly classified, and revealing himself could compromise ongoing intelligence operations. Better to remain silent and continue providing protection until the SEAL team was safely extracted. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop from the brutal heat of the desert afternoon. The changing conditions would favor the Americans during their extraction, providing cooler air for the helicopters and darkness to conceal their departure. Sullivan felt cautiously optimistic about their chances for the first time since the mission began. Rodriguez reported that Taliban activity in the surrounding area had decreased to almost nothing. The enemy fighters who remained in the region were keeping their heads down and avoiding any action that might attract attention from the deadly, accurate sniper who had already proven his capabilities so dramatically. Williams confirmed that their extraction remained on schedule, with helicopters departing their forward base as soon as darkness provided adequate concealment. The communications specialist estimated that aircraft would arrive at their position within 3 hours, assuming no mechanical problems or changes in the tactical situation. Chen's radio intercepts indicated that Taliban commanders in other areas were demanding explanations for the disaster that had befallen Hassan's force. The enemy leadership was clearly struggling to understand how a routine assault on trapped Americans had turned into such a devastating defeat for their own forces. The final hour darkness fell across the Afghan mountains like a protective blanket, bringing with it the promise of rescue for Sullivan's battered team. The temperature had dropped significantly from the scorching heat of the afternoon, and the cooler air would improve helicopter performance during the dangerous extraction flight into the mountainous terrain. Williams received final confirmation that 2 Black Hawk helicopters were airborne and approaching their position. The aircraft were flying a circuitous route to avoid known Taliban positions and would arrive at the extraction site within 30 minutes. The communications specialist felt a surge of relief as he relayed the good news to his teammates. Rodriguez maintained his vigilant watch through night vision equipment, scanning the approaches to their position for any last-minute threats. The Taliban had been quiet since their devastating defeat earlier in the day, but desperate enemies sometimes attempted final attacks when they knew their quarry was about to escape. Chen reported that Taliban radio traffic remained minimal, with most communications focused on the continuing evacuation from the area. The enemy forces that remained seemed more concerned with their own survival than with launching renewed assaults against the American position. Hassan's death had clearly broken the Taliban command structure in this sector. Garcia conducted final medical checks on his teammates, ensuring that everyone was physically capable of moving to the extraction site when the helicopters arrived. Thompson's concussion symptoms had improved, Rodriguez's shoulder wound was stable, and the various minor injuries were healing normally. The team was beaten up but functional. Sullivan began planning the movement to their extraction point, located approximately 200 meters from their current defensive position. The team would have to expose themselves briefly while crossing open ground, but the darkness and their unknown protectors' overwatch should provide adequate security during the short journey. Morrison watched the approaching helicopters through his scope, their navigation lights barely visible as they flew low through the mountain valleys. The Master Chief felt satisfaction knowing that his intervention had made this rescue possible. Without his long-range fire support, the SEAL team would have been overrun hours earlier. Thompson gathered the team's remaining equipment and prepared charges to destroy anything that might provide intelligence value to the enemy. The demolitions expert would trigger the destruction charges as they departed, ensuring that sensitive communications gear and operational documents would not fall into Taliban hands. Williams established direct radio contact with the incoming helicopters and began guiding them toward the extraction site. The pilots reported no enemy activity along their flight route, confirming that the Taliban withdrawal from the area was genuine rather than a tactical deception. Chen made final intercepts of Taliban communications, documenting the enemy's continued confusion and demoralization. The intelligence specialist had gathered valuable information about Taliban command structures and communication procedures that would prove useful for future operations in the region. Rodriguez spotted the lead helicopter approaching through his night vision scope, flying low and fast through the valley below their position. The aircraft's crew was using terrain masking to avoid detection, a dangerous technique that required extraordinary pilot skill in the mountainous environment. Garcia packed the team's medical supplies and prepared to assist anyone who might be injured during the movement to the extraction site. The team's medic remained alert for the possibility that Taliban fighters might attempt final desperate attacks against the departing Americans. Sullivan coordinated with the helicopter crews and confirmed the exact pickup location. The aircraft would land for no more than 2 minutes, just long enough for the team to board before departing the area at maximum speed. Every second on the ground increased the risk of enemy fire. Morrison began his own preparation for departure, knowing that the helicopter extraction would mark the end of his unauthorized involvement in the operation. The Master Chief would remain in position until the aircraft cleared the area, then begin his own stealthy withdrawal to avoid any Taliban search parties. Thompson triggered the destruction charges as the team prepared to move toward the extraction site. The explosions lit up the night briefly, destroying sensitive equipment and sending a final message to any watching Taliban fighters that the Americans were departing on their own terms. Williams guided the team toward the landing zone using night vision equipment and GPS coordinates. The 200-meter movement took place without incident, confirming that the Taliban had indeed abandoned their positions around the American defensive perimeter. Rodriguez provided rearguard security as the team moved, scanning behind them for any signs of pursuit. The sniper detected no enemy movement, though he remained alert until the last moment before boarding the extraction helicopter. Chen monitored Taliban radio frequencies during the movement and reported no change in enemy communications. The Taliban forces in the area appeared to be genuinely retreating rather than preparing ambushes along potential extraction routes. Garcia assisted Thompson, who was still experiencing balance problems from his concussion, during the movement to the landing zone. The team's medic ensured that everyone reached the extraction site safely despite their various injuries and the challenging terrain. Sullivan was the first to see the helicopters approaching the landing zone, their rotors creating dust clouds in the dry Afghan air. The team leader felt overwhelming relief as rescue finally arrived after the longest day of his military career. Morrison watched through his scope as the Blackhawks touched down and the SEAL team quickly boarded the aircraft. The Master Chief maintained overwatch until both helicopters lifted off and disappeared into the darkness, carrying their precious cargo of American warriors to safety. The extraction was completed without incident, with both aircraft clearing the area before any Taliban forces could respond. Sullivan's team was finally safe after surviving against impossible odds, though they would never know the identity of the mysterious sniper who had saved their lives. Rodriguez looked back at the Afghan mountains as the helicopter gained altitude and headed toward their forward base. Somewhere in that hostile terrain was an unknown American warrior who had demonstrated extraordinary skill and courage by intervening in their desperate battle. Williams transmitted final mission reports to headquarters as the helicopters flew toward safety. The communications specialist included detailed accounts of the mysterious sniper support that had turned certain defeat into survival, though he could provide no explanation for the intervention. Chen compiled his intelligence intercepts for analysis by specialists at higher headquarters. The captured Taliban communications would provide valuable insights into enemy operations and command structures throughout eastern Afghanistan. Garcia treated his teammates' injuries more thoroughly during the flight, now that he had access to better medical supplies and equipment. The team's medic was amazed that they had all survived such an overwhelming assault with only minor wounds. Thompson slept fitfully during the flight, his concussion finally taking its toll after the adrenaline of combat wore off. The demolitions expert would recover completely, but he would never forget the sound of that mysterious rifle fire that had saved their lives. Sullivan stared out the helicopter window at the dark landscape below, wondering about the identity of their unknown protector. The team leader would spend years trying to discover who had intervened in their desperate battle. But the answer would remain classified at levels far above his security clearance. Morrison watched the helicopters disappear into the distance, then began packing his equipment for his own departure from the area. The Master Chief would file a brief classified report about his unauthorized intervention, but he would never reveal his identity to the men he had saved. Hours later, as Sullivan's team underwent debriefing at their forward base, they learned that Hassan's compound had been completely evacuated. The Taliban withdrawal triggered by the commander's death had provided valuable intelligence about enemy networks throughout the region. The mission that was supposed to be simple observation had become a fight for survival that demonstrated the brotherhood among special operations forces. Somewhere in the Afghan mountains, an unknown warrior had risked his own mission to save fellow Americans, proving that the bonds forged in combat transcend official orders and classified operations. Sullivan would never learn that Master Chief Morrison had been the guardian angel who saved his team, but the memory of that mysterious intervention would remind him that in the dangerous world of special operations, warriors always looked out for each other when the chips were down.